This is Jim Clemmer. Delighted that you could join us on this webinar. It's clearly a topic that is near to lots of your hearts. We actually have 975 sites that have signed up today for this webinar. I certainly hope you find that it's worth far more than you're paying for it. I think the topic is well framed by Marshall Goldsmith's introduction that he wrote to the Extraordinary Leader or Coach book, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on. He taught how a leader that is an adept coach can enhance an organization's success, but either dabbles and doesn't take the process seriously, or maybe doesn't really know how to do it effectively, they can cause a great bit of harm. And part of what we're going to be talking about over the next hour or so is we're going to start off with a bit of background on Zenger, Folkman, and the Clemmer Group and how we ended up reconnected here and the work that we're now doing together. And within this background as well, we're going to talk a bit about some client feedback on using the process that we're about to go through. We're going to look at the difference between training, mentoring, and coaching and our definition and our approach to coaching. I think it's a critical difference amongst those three. And then we're also going to briefly talk about how does coaching really make a difference. And that really sets us up nicely for the first section, where we start to look at just how do we set expectations for coaching. Part of that is looking at the measurable impact that coaching has, and it's quite substantial. So we'll get that discussion. We'll talk a bit about what are some of the gaps when it comes to coaching and what gets in the way of effective coaching. In the second section, second step, we'll do common traps with coaching. We'll talk about the differences, the stark differences between having structure and not having structure, what a difference that can make. And we'll show you the structure that has emerged from the Zenger-Folkman research, which is called the FUEL framework, F-U-E-L, and we'll briefly look at that structure to help provide a much stronger process for effective coaching. In the third section, we'll look at this dependence that has developed in many organizations, these managers and employees, a cyclical negative dependence, and how we can break that and move to much more of an empowerment cycle. And we'll also talk a bit about what we've learned. I've been in this field now for some 30 years and been working coaching, developing leadership development for quite some time. And the Zenger-Folkman approach and the research we're going to be covering here throughout this broadcast is certainly the best that I've seen. And step 4 is going to get into some of that. There's a lot more science being brought in to what can be a pretty fuzzy topic area. And so we'll look at 14 differentiating competencies that have emerged from the Zenger-Folkman research. And we'll also look at learning from other disciplines can be brought in here and some other research bodies, and what we've come to believe are some of the keys to effective coaching. In our section, we'll look at how we can create, empower, and encourage coachees to seek out coaching, which makes the whole relationship work much more effectively, and talk about building a coaching culture and coaching capabilities in the organization. And then our last step, we'll touch briefly on the attributes of extraordinary coaches and some of the ways that we can monitor the effectiveness of coaching. So those are the 6 main steps we'll be walking through here, and then of course we'll wrap up with some next steps. If some of this has made some sense, what are some next steps? We're going to go for further information or some further things you can do to act on some of what we've covered here today. So let's right in to looking at the background and a bit of the relationship and how all this came to be and where some of this research has emerged from. So Folkman was founded about 10 years ago now with a focus on really revolutionizing leadership development through empirical research. And it's quite revolutionary what they've done. It certainly has impressed me. We're going to look at some of the evidence that is being brought to today's topic on coaching. They've brought a huge amount of evidence to a strengths-based approach and an overall comprehensive system that emerged and developed over these last 10 years. And we'll be touching on some of that and drawing from some of the approaches around strategy, culture, coaching development, so forth. Of course, we're really just covering a very tiny tip of a deep, big iceberg here. So the way that this has developed is the first book that Folkman brought out was called The Extraordinary Leader. And the whole strength-based approach and a map and a process came from. That was followed then by the Inspiring Leader, which was one of the key competency areas that kept emerging through the 360 and the competencies that Zenger Folkman had developed. And then the Extraordinary Coach came out a few years back. Before I had any association with Zenger Folkman, I actually reviewed the Leader many years ago, but I reviewed the Extraordinary Coach and said it's the best book on coaching that I'd ever seen. It's just an outstanding book that outlines in much more depth what we're going to touch on very briefly here today. Recently, last fall, How to Be Exceptional was published and has hit the top 10 favorite lists of the Globe and Mail and a number of other organizations that are tracking the best leadership and business books. Of the evolution, and in that time period, here's a list of some of the organizations that have used some of these approaches. Many of them are using the strength-based approach of the Extraordinary Leader. Quite a number of them now are combining that with the Extraordinary Coach and or in some cases with the Inspiring Leader, which are all offshoots or spin-offs of this material that we're covering. Some feedback from some clients specifically to the coaching approach and process that we're looking at today. And in this one, Courtney Rogers talks about how the empirical base really does get to the heart of coaching and that it's very situationally relevant and very contextually profound, and that it really does, I like this way he expresses this, threads the needle between theory and anecdotal practice and provides some real perspectives and tools that can really make a difference. We see from Ronald Galbraith how this is a critical leadership skill. It certainly is, and I think you'll see there's lots of practical guidelines and examples. So that's kind of the background on Zenger Folkman. Now, how did the Clemmer Group end up connected with Zenger Folkman? This is the first time in the 18 years that we've been in business that had this kind of partnership, and we're very excited about the partnership, and it really has a multitude of reasons for it. As Jack and I go back to actually 1981 when I was co-founder of the group. He had co-founded Zenger, and we did a lot of work together throughout the 80s and into the early 90s, and ended up going our separate ways. And about a year ago, last spring, we reconnected. And what really attracted me to what I saw of what Jack and Joe Folkman done was this whole strength-based approach using strong evidence and research. There's so many theories and concepts and models and frameworks. I did a recent search on for leadership books, and 90,000 titles came up. There's just an incredible array of ideas and thoughts on leadership, and similar in coaching, and being able to cut through all of that with some solid evidence. Well, what really works? What really makes a difference? And so what we'll see today is how some of those skills and philosophies and approaches for coaching are built on that foundation, but they very much align. And those of you who are familiar with my work will see strong alignment between what I've been talking about in my 7 books over the last 20-some years and in all of my work. Ongoing research and development is also, from the time we've worked with Zenger Folkman, has been something that's been pretty impressive. Just last month, we attended an International Partners Conference and learned about how they're extending and moving even further with more research and more development around these critical leadership topic areas. Actually, what also really attracted us was the strong fit with our own culture and leadership development approaches. And I know the people on this broadcast are subscribers to my blog and my newsletter, and you've heard me read my writing a lot of this or been in my audiences in the past. And our approach to creating desired culture is a 5-step process. And what we see here today is the second step particularly, which looks at behaviors or skill development, Zenger Folkman brings an incredibly strong research-based approach to building skills that is proving to align extremely well with all of our work on this better picture of leadership and culture development. There's been a big surge in coaching in the past decade. I've kind of given you the big picture. Now I want to zero down in more specifically to coaching itself. And we've seen a surge for a variety of reasons. Some of it has to do with succession planning and building strength. Executive coaching has just blossomed tremendously in the last 10, 20 years or so. We know more and more organizations are building internal coaching capabilities and using blends of internal and external coaches. Of course, it all is underlined by the need for leaders at all levels to develop coaching regardless of their role. I'm asking you a series of questions over over this broadcast, and a survey question. And you can see on your screen the survey questions will be popping up, and so we'll ask you to just complete these quickly and walk through them, and then as we follow up the session, we'll send you the results. Here's a question. This is basically choose one of these. Your organization uses external coaches for executives, use external coaches for special cases like high potentials or executives maybe with some edges to be set off a little bit. Or you use external coaches at all levels, so maybe you use them quite extensively, or rely on your managers to do all of your coaching. You're using peer coaching, or you're not providing any coaching support. So please choose one of those 6, and there'll be, I think there's a total of 6 more surveys or 5 more surveys that we have coming up that will get some data, get some input as we go along. And as I said, as a follow-up to today, we'll send you the results of this. So let's move on to looking at what are some of the distinctions between training and coaching. I think it's an important difference because the word coaching gets used, it's a bit like the word excellence or service or quality. It has a wide, or leadership, has a wide variety of meanings in various cultures. So for us, training is where we're imparting information or skill sets and a teacher-student relationship. And there's a lot of times when that's very appropriate. Mentoring, and here we particularly see a confusion of the terms mentoring and coaching a lot. For us, mentoring is where someone has greater wisdom or understanding or learning, has been down this path that the mentee is headed down, and provides connections, references, advice, etc. for the mentee. Coaching, and the way we're going to be talking about coaching here today and throughout this whole coaching skill development that we provide, is that it can come from, regardless of position. So coaching is an action, not a position. So there could be someone who is that is a leader or the manager, or it could even in some cases be a subordinate coaching their leader or manager, or it could be a peer. They don't have to have the same background or experiences, and it's to enable others to work through and solve their own problems. That's the primary role of the coach, and we see it as we're going to be defining it here. Our definition of coaching, to expand that then a little bit further, is that it is those interactions that help the individual being coached to expand their awareness, really discover superior solutions, look at and open up and look at different kinds of solutions, and ultimately make better and implement better decisions. And so it shows up primarily in performance coaching and career coaching. Now, it's not exclusively there, but that's what you'll see is predominantly where examples and our focus is going to be as we discuss this topic here today. So, does coaching really make a difference? Well, we're going to take a look at some of the research that Zenger Folkman has put together. They have 250,000 360s surveys that have been run on a wide variety of leaders and coaches. And so that's where some of this data is coming from. And what data is showing is that take a look at these two skill sets of energizing people to achieve results and coaching and mentoring others. And this is a strength. So somebody's really strong at making it happen. They get done. They draw results, energize people to make the results happen, but they're not so good at coaching and mentoring others. What's the likelihood that they'll be in the top 10% of leaders? Small, 7%. Not very highly rated as overall leaders. Now, what with the reverse? What happens if you end up with people who are strong at coaching and mentoring others, but they really get results? It's not really a strength. Well, it drops even lower to 4%. Now, to get into the real power of the synergy of these two, if you've got both of these strengths, if you were to do the straight math on the numbers I've just shown you, you would say, well, 11% if we add those two together. But in fact, if somebody is strong at both of these, 55% likelihood that they will be seen in the top 10%, 90th percentile of leaders, showing some pretty powerful combinations. So we're going to look at this a little bit further when we start to look at, well, how do we set expectations? And in a couple of minutes, I'll explore more of the research. But set expectations. Well, a bit of it philosophical, and it has to come back to, we go back to the father of modern management, as he's often been called, Peter Drucker. His observation that task is to lead people, it's to lift up a person's vision, it's to raise their performance to a higher standard, to build personality beyond normal limitations. I think that's a good way to start an expectation about values of coaching or a culture of coaching or a mindset or a belief that we bring to coaching. So how do we do some of that? How do we create coach expectations? Well, in our experience, it's getting the bottom line results, organizational effectiveness, and you'll see some examples of that momentarily. We just saw a bit of example of some of that research. It's looking at how senior managers sponsor and especially model coaching, and we tend to put a lot of focus on making sure we have the executive team on side and that they really are modeling this. And then it's making it visible. Here's some examples of ways that we might make coaching be visible. It's a topic at meetings. It's a still part of promotion decisions. So are we promoting people who are good people builders? Are we promoting people who are good capabilities in the organization? A drive for results. We can look for ways to highlight success stories and build coaching and people development into metrics and scorecards. Some of what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. Look at some of the Zenger Folkman research on this first point. Connect bottom line results and organizational effectiveness. Chart showing the extent to which think about quitting their current job. So percentage on the left is showing the percent of employees thinking about quitting. And then coaching effectiveness goes across the chart. So if there's a dramatic, it's half as many people think about quitting their job if they have a highly effective coach and leader. And we iceberg in the background because this is really showing the tip of the iceberg. And our next slide is going to show that the big problem often is that people who are thinking about quitting, well, some of them might quit and leave, but most of them quit and stay. So our next chart shows some of this phenomenon. Here we have employee commitment percentile and coaching effectiveness. See, this dramatic difference. It's a 9 times difference between very ineffective coaches, who first are the 10th centile, to highly effective coaches. We see dramatic differences there. So we can conclude from that employees whose managers are more effective dramatically more satisfaction and commitment. Or act on willingness to go the extra mile. Now, what this chart is showing because you might wonder, well, why isn't it way up at 80 or 90%? This is a number of people who checked off 5 out of 5 on these 60 scores. So they said they rated themselves a 5. If we had to put down the 4s, we'd probably be up at about the 80th or 90th percent with the very best coaches. Again, we see the same pattern. We see a difference here of almost 3 times, over 3 times, between highly effective coaches and very effective coaches. On to coaching on satisfaction. Again, starting to see the same thing. Overall, people feel about their immediate supervisor. And that clearly those who get the best coaching rate their supervisors much more positively than those that don't. And the same trend then continues as we look at coaching's impact on feeling valued. And as we would expect, employees who receive good coaching and feedback feel dramatically more valued. This has all kinds of implications. When you start to think about the amount of time, money, and energy that goes into retention, engagement, trying to attract and hold on to our very best people, we tend to have a lot of focus on organizational issues and compensation and benefits and daycare centers and all sorts of things, which can be of some effectiveness, but this is where the number one variable, the number one issue is on the level of coaching individuals are receiving. Activity as well, and we've come to this conclusion to say, well, all drivers of productivity can be increased through a leader's coaching, and Dreyer, in fact, said that a 10% increase in productivity would double the profits of most organizations. A way that we can really concise this, or kind of step back and look at it, as we begin to say, well, if we've got strong coaching effectiveness, that's going to lead to employee commitment, clearly going to lead to greater satisfied customers. Lots of research shows that to be the case, and which leads then to dramatically higher revenue and profitability. And there are a number of classic studies going back to the Sears study published in Harvard Business Review years ago to more up-to-date studies from a variety of organizations showing this relationship and this linkage between leadership and coaching effectiveness. Let's talk about the coaching gap. Here's an interesting study that showed that only 11% of employees listed their supervisor as someone whom they turn to for advice or problems at work. That, I think, is a serious problem. I don't think of my supervisor immediately as someone that I look to for advice at work. What is that saying about my action to my supervisor or about the kind of coach that she is? Here's what was done by a large telecom client of Zenger Folkman, which was part of the employee engagement work that they were doing. They were managers. To what extent do they feel that they're providing coaching to their employees? And they scored themselves quite high. Then they asked employees to what extent they feel they're getting coaching from their leaders, and the results were quite different. They scored their leaders quite low. There's a gap, and that gap shows up time and time again in all sorts of different studies. And so the question is why? Why is there this great misperception or misconnection between those who think they're doing coaching and those who think they're not really being coached? Well, here's some of the reasons. Here's some of the things that get in the way of coaching, aside from the perception problem. Is ask managers, well, why don't you do more coaching? No time. I don't have time to do it. I'm just so overwhelmed. There's so much here to do that I don't get to it. Well, I don't really get good coaching. So maybe I don't have a model to follow, or sometimes I hear managers almost talking as if, well, if I don't get coached, then I'm not coaching anybody else. I'm not even sure they're aware of that, but that's how it can come across. Or a lot of times managers will say, well, my employees are doing pretty well. They really don't need that much coaching. They're all pretty effective. Well, this reason that we often run into as to why there isn't more coaching happening But our conclusion is that underlying that are what we would consider to be the real reasons that a lot of coaching isn't happening. Is that some of the conversations can be uncomfortable, and maybe with a lot of people aren't really quite sure how to handle those, and so there may be a tendency to avoid them. Another and related to that first point is that we can feel pretty insecure about, well, what kind of impact is my coaching really having? Because it is often longer term. It's not immediate, solve this problem, put out this fire today. Now we're going to be addressing here in a few minutes is really understanding what good coaching is and confusing coaching with mentoring, training, and problem solving and a variety of other things. So we'll be talking about that one further. And lastly, it's not things. Rarely do you get an urgent email saying, hey boss, I need to meet at 2 o'clock for a coaching session. And we need to get this coaching session done before the end of the week. It's just one of those things that isn't that urgent. So it often gets put aside. It's whenever we can get around to it, one of these days if we have time. And of course, it tends not to happen very often. Second survey question. We've talked about some of the reasons why, well, the importance of coaching and then some of the reasons why it doesn't happen. So how about your organization? Is it perceived as a nice to do and it's not really tied to business outcomes? Is it others are crowding it out and taking precedence over coaching? Do you really have a problem with no real senior champions that are modeling and showing the way and really making sure coaching is happening? Is it really expensive to implement, to track, to train and track, and it's seen as an expense rather than as an investment? And it's hard. You find that the big problem is scalability. You have a real trouble trying to reach the majority of leaders. We're going to pass along the results of this follow-up to today's webinar. To point 2, we're around creating a coaching structure and process. I'm going to go with what are some of the common traps, like that little alligator just waiting there to snag us, that can cause the problems, that can get off track, cause managers, leaders, coaches to fall into these traps. Well, one is lack of preparation, just winging it. Let's just jump into the conversation and let's get going. So there is no structure. Really being clear about what the coachee wants from the conversation. The coach, especially if it's the manager, might be clear about what he or she wants, but we really clarified what would make this a valuable conversation for the coachee. Here's where we see some of the confusion of what coaching is, where there's a tendency for coaches to do the talking and offer advice way too early in the conversation before they really explored a lot of different alternatives, then perhaps not starting to wrap it up with a real commitment to change and then good accountability and follow through. So this is a definitive list of all the common coaching traps, but it's to help set up some of what we're about to talk about here. These are some of the common coaching traps, and we'll be talking about some of the later ones later on. But we're right now going to talk about lack of preparation. I want to step back a minute to some interesting research that was done a few years ago and is really making its way into the healthcare field in this book called The Checklist Manifesto. And where the book really came from is to say, well, why is it that we have such horrendous medical error problems around the world in our healthcare system? And why is it that the airline industry has a dramatically different health and safety record with substantially multitudes of times lower rates of accidents and errors and safety issues? And so the author set out to really look at that and began to bring in a very simple tool that the industry has been using for 50, 60 years now, which is the checklist. And you take on an airplane, you look in the cockpit, you'll see the pilot and the co-pilot going through the checklist. When Sullenberger landed that famous landing, 208 seconds he had to decide to land the plane in the Hudson River back in 2009, they still went through checklist. Now, it's a very high-level checklist, and it was a very quick checklist, but they used their checklist. In here, we haven't been doing that. In leadership, we sure haven't been doing that. Here's some examples. John Hopkins, using a checklist, dropped their infection rates from 11% to 0. The state of Michigan dropped their infection rates by 66% by using simple like checklists. So what seems to be at work here is that it helps us to really catch and make sure that we're following all of the steps. And even in 208 seconds, if Sully Sullenberger says, I need my checklist to make sure I land this plane safely, we clearly need to take a look at our use of checklists or structures as we think about leadership and certainly about coaching. So with a structure, we've got a lot more consistency, there's a lot more efficiency, and quality dramatically improves, as we just saw in the healthcare example, but there are multitudes of other examples. With that structure, and especially when it comes to coaching and leadership discussions, managers think coaching, employees don't, because there's nothing that really shows any kind of structure to it. Confidence certainly can decrease, and managers just wing it, revert to the old way of doing things. So the structure that we provide in this process and that all of this work is really built around is called FUEL. It's a 4-step structure. It starts with framing the conversation, understanding the current state, expect the desired state, and lay out a success plan. That's it, 4 steps. But you can't skip any of them, and there's a whole lot more depth to them. For example, in the Extraordinary Coach program, there's an extensive coaching guide which helps to guide coaches through each of these 4 steps and provides the call round questions that really get us deeper into and ensuring that we are following all of these steps and that we're using this as a checklist. And as we get feedback from organizations that have been using this approach now, we see one example of how this framework really has helped their organizations become fueled for success. Move on then to step 3, providing coaching skill development. I'm going to start this section actually with the survey rather than ending it. I'm going to get some sense from you of to what extent coaching do you give to your managers on the coaching that, or sorry, what would you give to your managers on the coaching that they currently provide? So an I would be incomplete, they just don't do it. A D or an F, they do so poorly it hurts more than helps, which is what Marshall Goldsmith said at the outset. They're okay, they do all right, it's somewhat helpful. E, or sorry, E, good thing, it is having an impact, and maybe you can measure some of that. A, you can really see significant impact, and maybe you're measuring in some of the ways that we talked about earlier, and you can dramatically see just how it makes a difference. Following up with, after this webinar with the results from this, but let's take a look at, and this survey questionnaire really started to set up some challenges in coaching skill development. What really requires significant unlearning, because the definition of what is coaching is often been distorted pretty badly. And many leaders really understand coaching. For example, they often look to the world of athletics, and we see that parallel all the time about on the field, and coaching people and teams, and using those coaching analogies. And our experience is that is not always that helpful, because that kind of coaching is where, yes, there are some things that are accurate, but others that are misleading. Giving advice or directing, or coach must have greater wisdom and expertise. Those 2 areas particularly lead people off track. And they could create a multitude of problems that really are moving now more towards training or mentoring. It really isn't true coaching. So skill development in coaching, true coaching, is how we can get from this tendency problem that we currently have in many, many organizations, where the employee is working away, complaining about what's not working, is wanting things to get better, provide ideas and advice, and maybe even uses suggestion box systems and so on for the managers, and ultimately they delegate upward to the manager. The manager then listens to the problem, gives advice, and expects results. And so we have this ongoing cycle. It's a very common cycle that's happening and is causing all kinds of time problems and so on. An empowerment or a growth cycle starts with the manager using good questioning, encouraging risk-taking and innovation, and empowering and trusting employees to solve their problems. With that, we now put more responsibility and ownership on the employee, and the employee then determines possible solutions, assess those risks, makes decisions, and ultimately owns more of what's happening. So what have we seen from us? Well, most leaders celebrate their coaching skills fairly high, again, because they often misunderstand coaching. And leaders do more heavy lifting to solve problems, which is that monkey on the back problem, taking on upward delegation problem. One CEO said many of the managers in this organization manage 1 or 2 levels below what they should be for their level and get into micromanagement because they see coaching as giving advice, as directing, etc. And many managers and many employees have a hard time identifying the coaching that they've received. There hasn't been a real clarity about it because, again, it's giving advice. And when leaders say, well, I do a lot of one-on-ones, but when employee report is a lot of that is about updates and project reports and very task-focused. Very little of it is on long-term development. We'll wrap up this section as well. We started the section with a survey. We're going to wrap up with one, which is where your organization in provide coaching skills development for line managers. We haven't done anything. Would be the first choice. You teach fairness, but don't really do much skilling. Sometimes just kind of quickly throw some education at people. You new managers get some training on coaching skills. Black populations of managers get training on coaching skills, or every year in the organization is being trained to be more skillful. So with that, let's move on then to step 4. Bring science to coaching, taking an evidence-based approach. Again, so much around on coaching and leadership. And what I mentioned earlier, the research that Zenger Folkman has compiled, there are now over 300,000 360 surveys that have been done on 36,000 managers that we can draw a tremendous amount of data from. And so here's some of the data, is looking at what are the competencies of highly effective coaches, the differentiating competencies. Well, Wester is around building strong relationships. So in C4 competencies there have to do with trust, relationships, collaboration. Now that highly effective coaches communicate effectively and listen and use powerful questions. We saw some examples of that in the fuel model earlier. And provide back and welcome feedback. We're going to look at that one a little bit later on. Help to set goals and performance expectations. So it's around facilitating action and results. So we saw that's that powerful combination we saw at the outset between coaching and developing and driving for results, making things happen. Providing ongoing support. So 14 competencies are what we've seen most differentiate highly effective coaches from less effective coaches. So that's our Folkman research. In this section, we want to take a look at some of the other research and what we can learn from other disciplines around this whole topic of coaching or coaching and counseling. Because for us, in organizations, coaching is really just a tool. It's the reason for our existence as leaders, as managers, as coaches. We aren't here just to coach. But for other professions, like counseling, social work, psychotherapy, clinical psychology, it is a reason for existence. And they have a tremendous depth there on what what works and what doesn't work. And we learn a lot from that as our quest here for more evidence to approaches that we're using in coaching. So there are clearly some differences between counseling, for example, and coaching, but there are also quite a lot of similarities. Is it that we can learn from those? We talked a bit about Zenger Folkman's research. There's some other bodies of research here that have also formed the foundation for a lot of the coaching material and coaching approaches that you're seeing here. And let's particularly take a look at motivational interviewing, which is a body of work and a series of book editions that have been done that are used quite extensively in the counseling field. And what they've found is that when counseling is done as a collaboration, it has a very different approach. When the helper is to help the individual develop some of their own ideas and insights rather than educating the patient, and maintaining that autonomy is a very key element. So it becomes more of an adult-to-adult conversation rather than an adult-child or a parent-child kind of conversation. So as we look at that, what are some practical things that we can maybe apply and draw over into our world of coaching and leadership development? Was to focus on topics that are really important to the coachee. Now, step 5 coming up, I'll talk a bit more about that. Ask for feedback at the end of formal coaching discussions. And that was an interesting new twist that many coaches don't do, and we'll come back and talk a bit more about that one. So what value of doing that? Well, if we go back to the counseling research that we've just looked at, what was found is when you're using those kinds of approaches where you focus on what's important, you clarify what's important, you ask for feedback on the effectiveness of what we've just done, attrition is cut in half. That is, people that drop out of counseling is reduced by half, and the effectiveness is increased by 65%. That's dramatic. So think about applying some of those findings and that research to our work of coaching. One of the things that we developed is, this is a sample of some of the questions on a short little written feedback form to the coach. So now asking the individual being coached to provide feedback to how well they feel the whole coaching conversation has gone. Do that. Focus on and ask for feedback. Well, it significantly changes the nature of the relationship, as just talked about, from parent-child to adults talking with each other. It changes the feelings of being in control. So who's owning this issue? Who's owning this problem? Who's moving this forward becomes a part of it. It also clearly changes the coach's behavior as he or she gets feedback on their effectiveness as a coach. Being asked for input changes the coach's or coachee's attitude and ratings of the coach's effectiveness. This I find particularly fascinating. So, for example, in this chart, where we the leadership effectiveness rating on the left, how individuals are rated as their effectiveness as leaders, and then across the bottom, we're looking at the extent the leader looks for feedback, asks for feedback, is learning from feedback, is seeking feedback, and looks relationship. Where there's very little feedback, rating effectiveness is quite low. Overall, this is all rating of leadership effectiveness on all dimensions. Where you ask for more feedback, it gets a little higher, starts to rise further. It's 10%, 80%. Look at dramatic jump. Again, we see over 4 times difference between leaders who are receptive and open to getting feedback and ask for feedback, how they're rated then as leaders, their leadership effectiveness. Let's close out this section with one more survey question. This time I ask you to take a look at how you're currently asking for feedback on coaching effectiveness. Do coaches do some feedback orally at the end of a coaching discussion? Do some form of written feedback that coach give to the coaches? Do you use more formalized 360 feedback Zenger Folkman's process is built around those 14 competencies. There's a 360 tool built around those. Do you link this in some way to your employee opinion or engagement surveys that specifically ask about coaching, or not ask for any kind of feedback on coaching effectiveness? So let's move on then to the keys to extraordinary coaching. And this starts to set us up for steps 5 and 6 that we're going to summarize here fairly quickly in the next few minutes. So keys: I'm the boss, performance management, reduces coaching effectiveness. And we put in quotations, I'm the boss, but it's kind of the whole sense of parent-child kind of relationship. And performance management typically isn't coaching, but people get this confused all the time. We need to manage performance, but that's a different discussion than coaching. It's done with the coachee, as we've really just talked about, and not to him. And external coaches don't have the answers. It's like, again, the sports coach, where you've got the wise old sage who's giving the players advice and observation and telling them to try something different. That's not effective coaching in the way of talking about it. And it's part of an ongoing process. So let's take a look at some of those steps of that ongoing process. So one is to increase the pull and build organizational capabilities. We're really getting at here, again, if we're going to have an adult-to-adult relationship and going to have coach and coach working more in a partnership, then clearly when coaching is requested, it's going to be much more effective and turns into much more of a two-way street. So there's opportunities and a process. We need to create opportunities in a process to access coaching, to make everybody. It may be high potential programs, and we might be linking coaching, which is receive training, with those who want the coaching. So again, we've developed what we found to be a very effective discussion tool to make all of this happen. So here's an example of a few questions off of a coaching topic checklist that coachees can use to input or be part of that step 1 in the fuel model, frame the conversation. What is it we should focus on? What should this coaching discussion be about? So this gives us a tool or an example for doing that. Well, build culture organizational capability. We start to summarize and step back and look at some of what we've heard here. We need to build a supporting infrastructure. We need to have coaches. We need to have learning communities. We need to build expertise in-house. Senior leaders need to buy in, develop, model, set expectations for all of this. We need to build coaching leaders, build their skills, create some sustainability, link the leaders with the coachees in some of the ways that I've just talked about, and measure progress is going to be our last step here momentarily. And for these, as we've just been discussing, helping open up conversations for them to create opportunities to ask coaching, to ask for coaching, to own more of the whole coaching process and the coaching conversation. So let's on then and look at this last area, which is how we measure and monitor and strengthen accountability. And to start, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the attributes of extraordinary coaches. So if we're thinking about measuring coaching, what are the kinds of things that we should be measuring? We'll take a look at to the degree to which the value set or caring about the coachee's progress is in place. And is there a strong sense that people can grow, change, and improve? Are we focusing on the future and building future capability? Are we beyond the immediate job performance and allow actions to come from within coachee, as we've just talked about, and more frequent and shorter conversations, and then supporting and encouraging. So some of these things are more qualitative and sort of softer measurement or softer values, culture fit that we can be getting at. Well, we're going to in a moment about some of the more quantitative ways of measuring this, and I want to do that with this survey question, our last one here of our time together. So it's looking at how we measure coaching effectiveness and create accountability. Is it a corporate value where those behaviors, such as we've just talked about, are discussed and are a key element in the culture of your organization? Use something Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, the 4 different levels of the impact of coaching training. Do you have kind of ROI, return on investment, for the use of external coaches, where you can link it back perhaps to impacts on employee engagement, productivity, customer satisfaction, turnover, etc.? Is it been the leader's development plan? So maybe it's part of succession planning or capability planning that's happening in your organization. Or using 360 surveys or employee opinion surveys as a way of measuring the effectiveness of coaching. So some of the common ways that we can get measuring coaching, really it's a combination as we look at how monitoring can happen. It's a combination of informal and more formal kinds of observations, such as surveys that we've just talked about, different sorts of methods, opinion surveys, 360 feedback, scorecards of different sorts, and performance appraisals. And all be different ways that we can monitor and measure coaching to make sure that what we're doing is having an impact. That was a quick run through what's pretty deep area, this whole big topic of coaching. And I've just skipped over 6 icebergs here very quickly. There's lots of depth under each one, and we'll certainly be following up with you in a series of more resources and materials. But here I would summarize is that, so the 6 steps we've talked about is make sure that we've got the expectations set, that leaders will coach, that is part of our culture. Let's give structure and a process, methodology to follow. Like fuel process we've talked about, having some kind of checklist or structure to follow. Clearly we need to make sure people know how to provide good coaching, and do they understand the differences between training, mentoring, and coaching. We're sure that we're bringing a methodology or an approach that's grounded in some research or evidence, and isn't just someone's best guess or thoughts of what ought to happen. We talked very briefly on the importance of pulling the coachee into the coaching process and making it much more of an adult-to-adult partnering kind of conversation. And lastly, we touched briefly on measuring and strengthening coaching accountability, which really needs to be part of how we build a coaching culture. So one bit of feedback from a client using this approach. And this Steve is talking about the FUEL framework, how it's really helped at Narration create a strong coaching culture. We've heard of numerous ways that the FUEL methodology and the FUEL framework has been helping organizations with these kinds of discussions. 14 competencies, here they are again. What I've taken you through very quickly, there are 2 versions of the Extraordinary Coach program. One is a one-day session that uses the FUEL model and uses many of the approaches we've just gone through. Second is a 2-day version, which also adds then a 360 tool built around these 14 competencies. The whole strengths-based approach is part of how all of this is framed in an even larger setting. The Extraordinary Leader program, which you can find lots more information on our website, and we'll provide some more links to, is a powerful process that is also built on evidence, helps to build a highly personalized development plan, as does the coaching program, and it uses a 360 tool. What can you do next with all of this? Well, we're going to send a follow-up email, and we'll ask you if you have already completed the survey online to complete it. Follow-up email. And those of you who do complete this, we will have a draw for one of 2 copies of the Extraordinary Coach book. And we put it's in North America just because of the mailing costs of sending out the books. So we will send them in North America. And we'll link to an archive of this presentation. So you can go back, and it is the slides and the audio archived here. And we'll also link you to an outstanding paper written by Jack Zenger and Catherine Stinnett, who are the real founders and originators of this coaching process. And the bringing sense to the art of coaching is a good summary of a lot of what I've just covered here. We have another broadcast that's available for you on March 4th that HR.com is doing. Sponsor me in. There's no charge for this. You can go to their website, and we will link you to this in our follow-up email. And that's found the strength-based approach of the Extraordinary Leader Program, which I referred to here briefly in a couple of slides ago. Those in Ontario and the Toronto area, we do a complimentary briefing the morning of March 19th, where it's really split in 2 parts. The first part is the Extraordinary Leader and the strength-based leadership development process. And the second part will be more discussion, as we've gone through here, a little longer discussion of the Extraordinary Coach program that we've just talked about here. So register for that at clemmergroup.com. Lastly, I'll mention that we have some public workshops coming up as well that are in Toronto and Calgary. The Toronto have been set May 15th and 16th. So on the 15th, we'll be doing the Extraordinary Leader. On the 16th, we're doing the Extraordinary Coach. You can do one or the other or both. And the pricing and information and registration is all available on our website. We're just finalizing the dates in Calgary. It'll probably be the first week of May, where we'll be doing the same 2-day workshop, 2 days back to back. There is a little discount that we'll tell you about as well that's available, that all of these books, McGraw-Hill, who've published all of these books, have a special discount available. So we'll be giving you a link to all of those. Thanks very much for joining us. It has been a real whirlwind tour, and I know I've covered a lot of ground very quickly. The problem often is in doing a webinar like this, I have to decide, well, do I cover less ground and go in more depth, or do I do a broader overview and then give you areas where you can go down deeper into it at your leisure? And that's the decision I made, was to do the broader overview. And I know that for some of you, you wish I would have gone into much more depth in some areas. But you can find here in the Leadership Resource Center or lots more information on our website or the Zenger Folkman website, or I'm happy to connect with you directly if you'd like to talk further about anything that we've covered today. So thank you very much for joining us, and happy coaching.